Jason J. Harper was a Vietnam War veteran, 78 years old, living in the small town of Springling, Arkansas. His home, an old, slightly leaning house on the edge of the town, was filled with old photographs and military medals. It was a place where Jay often sat in silence, his mind wandering back to the trials and challenges he had faced in his life, both on and off the battlefield. Though his body showed the marks of age, his eyes remained sharp, and his movements were steady and purposeful. Over the years, Jay had become the town's unofficial mechanic, fixing cars and lending a hand to neighbors with small tasks. He was well respected but seldom attracted much attention. On a warm morning, after picking up groceries at the local market, Jay was driving his old pickup truck down the familiar road back to his house. The truck was more than just a vehicle. To him, it was a piece of his history, a reminder of the past, and he had worked on it with his own hands, restoring it to its current state over the years. It rumbled down the road, as it always had, its engine coughing with age, but still running strong. Without warning, red and blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror, the sharp sound of sirens cutting through the quiet morning. Jay slowed the truck and pulled over to the side of the road, his hands instinctively gripping the steering wheel as he came to a stop. He had seen his share of stops and confrontations in his lifetime, but this one felt different. The heat of the sun reflected off the cracked pavement, the air thick with the quiet hum of the town waking up around him. Two young officers stepped out of their patrol cars, their movements hurried, their eyes scanning the pickup truck with suspicion. They were quick to approach the vehicle, one of them already holding a notepad, ready to write down any excuse that could justify the stop. They were impatient, too eager to assert their authority, not realizing that the man they were facing had seen more in his lifetime than both of them combined. The officers began their routine inspection, eyes narrowing as they looked over the truck. The vehicle, though functional, showed signs of age and neglect. Its registration expired, the plates crooked and worn. They asked questions, not waiting for any explanation, their tone dismissive and rushed. Jay remained silent, his weathered hand still resting on the wheel, his gaze fixed ahead, unflinching. They moved around the truck, inspecting the tires and the engine, continuing their search for a reason to fine or detain him. One of the officers made a note about the missing registration sticker, while the other jotted down something about the state of the vehicle. To them, it was just another violation, another old man driving an unfit truck through their town. They didn't see a hero or a man who had given decades of service to his country. To them, Jay was simply an old man who didn't fit the rules. The silence between Jay and the officers grew heavy, but he said nothing. His years of military service had taught him patience, and he knew better than to provoke or argue. He had survived the jungles of Vietnam, countless ambushes, and the weight of losing friends in the line of duty. A simple traffic stop, even one filled with disrespect, was nothing in comparison to the horrors he had once faced. The officers, frustrated by the lack of a response, began to grow more insistent. One of them, the younger of the two, began to circle the truck, tapping on the side of the vehicle with his pen, as if searching for a reason to escalate the situation. The older officer, with a stern face, stood by, arms crossed, watching as his partner continued his questioning. They didn't understand why Jay wasn't more flustered. After all, he wasn't even responding. Surely, they thought, he was hiding something. The tension in the air was palpable, but Jay sat still, his posture unwavering. He had faced much worse in his life, and this was nothing more than an inconvenience. He was used to being dismissed, used to being overlooked. It was the way things had always been since he came back from the war. The officers didn't know it, but they were facing a man who had been through more than they could ever imagine. As the younger officer reached into his car to check the computer for more information, the air seemed to grow thicker. Jay looked out at the small town beyond, his mind wandering to places he hadn't thought about in years. He remembered the jungle, the rain-soaked nights, the crack of gunfire in the distance. The world he once knew felt a lifetime away. Now, all he wanted was to go home, to return to his quiet life, but it seemed the past, like the truck he drove, refused to be forgotten. The officers continued their routine, oblivious to the man they were dealing with. The silence between them grew, and Jay, still unmoving, waited. The officers quickly examined Jay's truck, their eyes scanning the worn vehicle with a sense of skepticism. The absence of proper license plates, the faded paint, and the rusted body all stood out to them, marking it as nothing more than an old, neglected machine. One officer's suspicion deepened, while the other's curiosity began to grow. They didn't speak, but their glances told a story. One officer was thinking of protocol and regulation, while the other seemed to wonder if there was more to this man than met the eye. Jay remained silent throughout the inspection. His face was calm and unreadable, like a stone wall that had been built over years of experience. His hands, wrapped in worn leather gloves, gripped the steering wheel with a firm but steady hold. He didn't flinch, didn't react, despite the officer's increasingly intrusive questions and comments. His truck, his lifeline, had seen better days, but to Jay, it was more than just an old vehicle. It was a part of his past, a piece of history that no one could truly understand unless they had lived through it. To him, the truck didn't need any official documentation to prove its worth. It was a relic of a time that the officers knew nothing about. The officers began demanding more identification, asking for his driver's license and vehicle registration, but Jay didn't offer them anything beyond what he had already shown. He handed over his veteran's ID card and an old military identification, both worn with age. To the officers, these were just more pieces of paper, meaningless in the grand scheme of things. They laughed at the sight of the veteran's ID, dismissing it as nothing more than a trinket. They continued to circle the truck, peering inside and under the hood, searching for a reason to escalate the situation, their voices growing slightly. More impatient, Jay sat still, unaffected by their dismissive attitude. He knew the world had changed since he'd been a young man, but it didn't matter. He had learned long ago that silence was often the best weapon. And so he waited. He waited with the quiet resilience of someone who had seen it all, endured it all, and come out the other side stronger for it. The minutes stretched on as the officers grew increasingly restless. One of them returned to his patrol car, checking the computer for any information on the truck, the driver, or anything that might explain the situation. Jay didn't need to look at them to know what they were doing. He knew how it went. They would search for something that would justify their stop, something to give them the power they felt they had lost in that moment. But Jay knew better. He had seen enough bureaucracy in his life to know that nothing they found would ever truly capture the essence of who he was or what he had done. The sun beat down relentlessly, casting long shadows on the cracked asphalt. The heat seemed to intensify the tension in the air, making it feel thicker, more suffocating with each passing second. The quiet hum of the small town around them went unnoticed, as the officers' focus remained entirely on Jay. The passing cars slowed, curious drivers watching the scene unfold, unaware of the man sitting calmly in the truck, his posture unwavering. Inside the truck, Jay's mind wandered back to a time when he had been forced to wait under far worse conditions. He thought of the jungle, of the endless days spent in mud and rain, of the nights spent listening to the sounds of distant gunfire, of the moments when survival depended on patience and restraint. What he was enduring now, this stop on the side of the road, was nothing in comparison. But there was something about it, something about how easily the officers had dismissed him, that bothered him. It wasn't just the truck or the registration. It was the fact that they hadn't even tried to understand who he was. They hadn't asked the right questions. hadn't made the effort to see beyond the surface. They had only seen an old man, a relic of the past, someone they could disregard without a second thought. Jay had long since learned that the world often overlooked men like him, men who had served, who had sacrificed, who had lived through things most people could never imagine. It was a quiet kind of dishonor, one that gnawed at the edges of his soul, but never truly consumed him. He had come to terms with it years ago, but today, in this moment, he felt the sting of it anew. Still, he remained silent, his hands steady. On the wheel, his gaze focused ahead. He had nothing to prove to these officers, to anyone. He had done his part. The world, it seemed, had moved on without him, but that was fine. It always had been. All he had to do now was wait. And so he did. He waited as the officers continued to circle, to inspect, to search for something that wasn't there. Minutes turned into an hour. The officers began to grow frustrated, their conversation drifting toward impatience. They had checked the truck, checked the paperwork, and found nothing to support their initial suspicions. But Jay didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply waited, as he had done countless times before, for the world to catch up with him. The crowd around Jay began to grow as more and more locals noticed the scene unfolding. They didn't know the details, but they recognized Jay, a man who had been part of their community for decades, a man they all respected. His presence was constant, his contributions undeniable. Yet now they watched in confusion as two officers circled around his truck, questioning him with an intensity that felt out of place. Whispers spread like wildfire, each person offering their own theories. Some thought it was just a misunderstanding, others speculated that something more sinister was afoot. But the one thing everyone agreed on was that this didn't seem right. Jay sat still, perched on the curb like a statue carved from time itself. His hands rested calmly on his knees, his weathered face betraying no emotion as the voices of the crowd grew louder, the murmurs, the stares, the passing comments. It all felt distant to him, like a faint echo of a world that no longer understood the meaning of respect. He had weathered storms much fiercer than this. Vietnam had taught him how to endure, how to survive, and how to remain calm when chaos swirled around him. The war had taken much from him, but it had also given him something, a resilience that nothing could break. The officers, still with no real cause, began to grow more desperate. They walked around his truck again, peering inside, searching for something, anything that might justify the scene they were creating. Jay felt their eyes on him, their judgment, but he didn't flinch. His gaze remained fixed ahead, unwavering. He had seen too much in his lifetime to be rattled by petty authority. Then, one of the officers, clearly becoming frustrated with the lack of progress, suggested they search the truck for weapons. The idea seemed absurd, but Jay didn't react. He knew this wasn't the moment to resist. Instead, he slowly and deliberately climbed out of the truck, moving with the quiet confidence of a man who had long ago learned the art of restraint. He didn't fight it, didn't argue. He simply stood there, waiting. As he stepped away from the truck, he could hear the voices of the crowd rising, the mixture of curiosity and concern palpable in the air. He didn't need to look around to know that they were watching, some waiting for a confrontation, others unsure of what to make of the situation. The officers, for their part, began to rummage through his truck with increasing urgency, opening the compartments, searching under the seats, and peering into every corner of the vehicle. It was clear they were hoping to find something that would validate their actions, something that would justify the way they were treating this old man. Jay knew this moment was not about him, not really. It was about their assumptions about who he was and what he was worth. To them, he was just another old man in a beat-up truck. But to Jay, this truck, this old thing, was a part of his history, a piece of his identity. It was more than just a vehicle. It was a symbol of everything he had fought for, everything he had lost. And yet none of that seemed to matter to the officers. They were searching not for the man, but for an excuse. The officers didn't understand that Jay had already fought battles that no one could comprehend. He had faced death, he had lost friends, and he had survived the horrors of war. And here, on the side of the road in a quiet town, they were treating him like an inconvenience, like an afterthought. Jay knew he could protest, he could demand respect, but that wouldn't change anything. He had seen how the world had changed, how respect had become a commodity, something that was only given to those who had the right badge, the right title. But Jay had something they didn't: experience. He had learned long ago that the world was filled with people who would never understand him, and that was okay. He had never needed their approval. He had always known that in the end, the only thing that truly mattered was his integrity, his actions, and the way he had lived his life. Still, the pressure of the moment weighed on him. The officers were growing more impatient, their frustration mounting with each passing minute. The crowd was waiting for something to happen, some sort of resolution, but Jay remained calm, steadfast in his silence. He knew that this too would pass. It was just another test, one more challenge in a life filled with them. As the officers continued their search, Jay felt the heat of the sun pressing down on him. It wasn't just the physical heat, it was the pressure of the moment, the weight of the world around him. But he stood tall, his back straight, his hands at his sides. He had nothing to hide, and no matter what they found, it wouldn't change who he was. The truth of it all was simple. He had already paid his dues. The world had moved on, but he had not. He remained who he had always been, even if no one else could see it. The officer's search grew more thorough, and Jay could feel the tension in the air. The crowd was watching closely now, some with sympathy, others with uncertainty. They didn't understand why this was happening, why Jay was being treated like a criminal. But for Jay, it was just another moment in a long series of battles, both physical and emotional. And as he stood there, in the scorching heat, surrounded by whispers and stares, he couldn't help but wonder if this was just one more battle he had to face. Not for himself, but for the people around him, for the legacy he had built without ever asking for recognition. The officers found nothing. They returned to their cars, exchanging quiet words, still not fully understanding who they had stopped, who they had judged so hastily. Jay, however, remained standing, his gaze fixed ahead. The pressure had not broken him. It never would. A few minutes passed, and the sound of a heavy engine rumbled down the road. The black truck with tinted windows pulled up beside the growing crowd, its tires crunching the gravel. The vehicle came to a slow stop, and the door swung open. A man in full military dress stepped out, his posture rigid, the weight of his uniform a stark contrast to the scene unfolding on the roadside. It was General William Johnson, a man whose name held weight, especially in the circles of those who had served in the military. He had been with Jay in 1969 during their deployment in Vietnam. The two had fought side by side, shared in the horrors of war, and built a bond that time and distance had not been able to break. As soon as the general's eyes fell on Jay, a flicker of recognition passed across his face. Despite the years and the changing world, he could still see the same man standing there, the same resilience, the same quiet strength. Without hesitation, the general approached the officers, his steps firm, his presence commanding. The police officers, still lingering in their disbelief, turned to face the man who had just arrived. The sight of his uniform and the calm authority he exuded made them momentarily pause. They exchanged confused glances, unsure of how to proceed. General Johnson ignored their uncertainty and addressed them directly. His voice was steady, firm, yet there was an underlying warmth in it as he spoke. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. Instead, he focused on the most important thing, the man standing quietly by his truck, who was anything but just another old man in a beat-up vehicle. "This man you've detained," the general said, gesturing toward Jay, "is my teacher. He is a hero." The words hung in the air for a moment. The officers, stunned and unsure of how to react, stood silent. The general's presence was enough to shift the entire dynamic. The people in the crowd, who had been watching with a mixture of curiosity and tension, fell silent too. They knew who the general was. They had heard the stories, the respect that followed his name, but they hadn't known the man beside him. The general didn't stop there. He continued, speaking with the authority of someone who had lived through battles that most people could never imagine. He told the officers that Jay wasn't just another veteran. He was one of the finest commanders the army had ever known. His name had been on every list of distinguished soldiers. His actions and decisions had saved countless lives. He spoke of Jay's bravery, his leadership, and the kind of man he was. The kind of man who had earned the respect of everyone who had ever served under him. The officers, who had been so eager to find fault, now stood dumbfounded. Their skepticism faded as they slowly began to grasp the reality of the man they had just tried to undermine. They could not fathom the weight of Jay's history, nor could they understand the significance of what the general was saying. But the truth of it was undeniable. The general's words were a heavy blow to their assumptions, shattering any preconceived notions they had about this quiet, elderly man in the truck. The crowd, too, began to stir. The whispers that had once carried suspicion now shifted to admiration. People who had known Jay for years, who had only seen him as the old man who worked on their cars or helped them with odd jobs, now saw him through new eyes. They saw the man who had once led men through the darkest of times, the man who had sacrificed more than most could comprehend. In that moment they understood that Jay was not just a veteran. He was a living piece of history, a man whose actions had shaped lives and saved futures. The officers stood there, their earlier confidence replaced with uncertainty. They had come to the situation with their own judgments, their own assumptions about age, about appearance, and about who deserved respect. But as they listened to General Johnson, they realized how wrong they had been. They were no longer facing an old man in a truck. They were facing a legend. And in the silence that followed the general's intervention, something shifted. The officers, now aware of the weight of their mistake, stood awkwardly. Their stance, which had once been full of authority, was now hesitant. The general's presence had stripped away the power they thought they held. And with that, the situation began to resolve itself, not through force or confrontation, but through the quiet revelation of the man who had earned the right to be respected. Jay remained silent throughout, his posture unchanged, his hands still resting calmly at his sides. He didn't need to say anything. The general had already spoken for him. The truth had been laid bare, and the crowd, once unsure, now stood in quiet reverence, knowing that they had witnessed something rare, a moment when true respect, earned through a lifetime of service and sacrifice, was finally acknowledged. The crowd lingered, their attention now fully on Jay. What had started as an isolated incident on a quiet street corner had transformed into something far bigger. Word of what had happened spread through the town like wildfire. People whispered among themselves, exchanging stories of Jay's quiet generosity, his years of service, and the reputation he had built as the steadfast man who had seen more than most would ever know. For many, it was a revelation. They had known Jay as the older man who worked on cars and fixed fences, who greeted them with a soft smile and a quiet word. But now they saw him differently. They saw him as the man who had walked through hell and back, who had led soldiers with courage and integrity, and who had given his life to a cause greater than himself. They no longer viewed him as just another retiree, but as someone who had earned the kind of respect that few people would ever understand. The officers, standing at the center of the gathering, shifted uncomfortably. They were still processing everything that had transpired, unsure of how to reconcile their previous actions with the man they now knew stood before them. One officer, the younger of the two, stepped forward, his face flushed with shame. He had been the most eager to question Jay, the most insistent on enforcing protocol. Now he found himself at a loss for words. His gaze flickered between Jay and the general, then back to the crowd that had grown even more silent in the wake of the revelation. After a long moment, the officer mumbled an apology, his voice tight. But Jay, still standing as steady as ever, simply shook his head. There was no anger in his eyes, only quiet resolve. He met the officer's gaze, and in a calm, measured tone, he spoke. "Don't apologize to me, son. Apologize to the next man you stop before you make the same mistake." His voice was firm, but there was a gentleness to it, a reminder that respect, once lost, could only be rebuilt through understanding and humility. The officer nodded, his shame evident. But Jay did not linger on the moment. He had learned long ago that certain battles were not worth fighting. The officer's words, the apology, would mean little if it were not followed by a change in action. And Jay knew that sometimes true recognition did not come in grand gestures, but in the quiet transformations of those around him. As the crowd began to disperse, Jay made his way home, the weight of the moment still settling in his mind. The streets of Springling felt a little different now, the air heavier with respect, the townspeople's eyes following him with a new sense of understanding. When he reached his modest home, the familiar scent of old wood and leather greeted him. He stepped inside, his movements slow but steady, the quiet of the house offering him a moment to reflect. It was then that his neighbor, Mrs. Garrison, knocked on the door. She held an envelope in her hand, a letter that had arrived for him that day. Jay took the letter from her, a quiet thank you in his eyes as he closed the door behind her. He slid his finger along the seal and opened the letter, unfolding the paper within. As he read, his heart tightened. It was from a young veteran, a man Jay had saved from the jungles of Vietnam many years ago. The veteran wrote about the moment Jay had pulled him from danger, about the calm strength Jay had shown in the face of death, and about how that moment had shaped the man he had become. The letter was filled with gratitude, but also with something deeper. Recognition of the man, who had quietly, without fanfare, given everything for those who followed him. Jay's hands trembled slightly as he finished reading. The words, though simple, carried the weight of a lifetime. For a brief moment he allowed himself to feel something he rarely did. Pride. It was not a boastful pride, nor the kind that demanded attention. It was the quiet pride of knowing that his actions, though often unseen, had made a difference, that the legacy he had built was still alive, carried forward by those he had helped, those whose lives he had touched. He placed the letter on the table and stood there for a moment, staring out the window. The town outside seemed unchanged, the same as it had been when he first arrived all those years ago. But inside, something had shifted. Jay could feel it, the quiet shift of respect, the change that had begun not just in the eyes of the people around him, but deep within his own heart. He had never needed recognition. He had never sought it. But today he had received it in a way he had never imagined, and for the first time in a long time, Jay allowed himself to feel the quiet satisfaction of knowing that, in the end, he had been seen, not as the old man in the truck, but as the man he had always been. Several days passed since the incident, and the town had started to heal from the event. Word of what had transpired spread far beyond the initial scene, and the respect Jay had earned grew by the day. He was invited to a local veterans meeting, a gathering of old comrades who had served with him in Vietnam. They greeted him with a mix of admiration and reverence. These were men who had seen the worst of humanity, who had fought side by side with him in jungles and villages far from home. Now, as they stood together again, they looked at Jay with a sense of pride and gratitude, knowing what he had endured and what he had given. But it wasn't just his fellow veterans who respected him now. The people of Springling, once indifferent, had begun to understand the depth of the man they had overlooked. What had started as a moment of conflict had transformed into a story of recognition and redemption. Jay continued his quiet work, helping fellow veterans with home repairs, building ramps, and offering whatever assistance was needed. He had always been there for those in need, and now the town saw that his acts of kindness were not just isolated events, but part of a long, steady commitment to others. In recognition of his contributions, the town of Springling declared October 10th as Jason Harper Day. A small plaque was erected in his honor at the town's central square. It was a simple plaque, nothing grand or flashy, but it stood as a symbol of the quiet service and dedication Jay had shown throughout his life. The inscription was brief but profound. It was a reminder that greatness could be found not in fame or recognition, but in the simple, everyday acts of respect, duty, and service to others. Jay still drove his old pickup truck, the one that had once been the subject of so much scorn. The truck, like him, had been through a lot. It had its share of dents, rust, and stories, but it still ran. It still served. He continued his work, making sure every ramp was built, every path paved, and every home that needed repair was restored. But now, when he drove through the streets of Springling, he was met with nods of respect and recognition. People stepped aside to let him pass, some even stopping to offer a friendly word or a handshake. The quiet respect that surrounded him was not born from fear or obligation, but from a genuine understanding of who he was and what he had done. Jay had never asked for this kind of attention, and he never sought glory or praise. His reward had always been in the satisfaction of helping others, in the knowledge that his actions had made a difference in the lives of those who needed it most. And now, even as he went about his daily life, he understood that his legacy would live on long after he was gone. He didn't need the plaque or the recognition to know that his life had mattered. The people who had been touched by his kindness, the veterans he had helped, and the community that had finally recognized his worth, these were the ones who would remember. They would remember not just the quiet, unassuming man who had once been a soldier, but the man who had spent his life serving others, who had never forgotten the value of respect and duty even when the world around him had. In the end, Jay didn't need grand monuments or public ceremonies to leave a mark. His legacy was in the simple, unspoken understanding that respect, honor, and service were the true measures of a life well lived. The streets of Springling would remember him, not for the accolades or the plaques, but for the quiet, steady presence he had been throughout his years. He had earned their respect, not with words, but with actions, and in that his legacy would endure.